Welcome to the debate. For years, the security consensus, the one governing Europe and the transatlantic relationship, it rested on two really solid principles: collective security and the inviolability of national borders. But recent months have just seen these aggressive unilateral actions, policy U-turns, and profound strategic shifts. And they're all emanating from Washington. It's profoundly shaken that consensus. Global turbulence isn't a risk anymore, it's the central reality shaping everything from Kyiv to the Arctic Circle. And this, well, it forces a single, unavoidable question. Has Washington turned its back on Ukraine? Or let's be more precise, can Kyiv still trust the United States, especially after everything that's happened with Greenland?
I'm Andrea. Join me with Anastasia in the latest edition by Defense Report for a sharp, no-nonsense breakdown of the latest in global defense news, military technology, and strategic developments. And today we are really focusing on that tension, the extreme tension, between the current U.S. administration's expansionism. You see it perfectly with its threats against a founding NATO ally, Denmark, over Greenland, and its stated commitment to Kyiv's survival. So the core conflict we're analyzing is whether a foreign policy that prioritizes, territorial gain and transactional leverage, what some analysts are calling the Donroe Doctrine, whether that fundamentally undermines the stability Ukraine needs to keep fighting.
And to all our listeners, please subscribe to Defense Reports. It's your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports.
Ryan, so as you just outlined, this is really the existential question, isn't it? Can you rely on a partner who threatens the very framework of your alliance?
My position is that, well, strategic necessity has to trump temporary political friction. And look, I acknowledge the unsettling nature of this expansionism and the Donroe Doctrine, specifically the public refusal to rule out military or economic force for annexing Greenland. I get it. But the practical requirement for U.S. military power, it remains non-negotiable for Kyiv. And the evidence is right there in the outcome. The full resumption of large-scale military aid and intelligence sharing, which had been briefly suspended, was confirmed back in March 2025. It shows that the partnership, while challenging, often stressful, it remains viable because the U.S. simply cannot afford a Russian victory, not while it's trying to manage the long-term competition with Beijing.
See, I come at it from a fundamentally different place. The aggressive unilateralism we saw over Greenland, coupled with the explicit punitive pressure tactics used directly against Kyiv. To me, that proves the U.S. is an inherently unreliable and honestly a potentially destabilizing partner. We are talking about an ally that threatens to annex the territory of a founding NATO member, Denmark, and in the same breath asks a war-torn partner, Ukraine, for massive financial concessions in exchange for weapons. This pattern, it's about prioritizing America-first imperial goals over foundational security principles. And that makes the U.S. dangerously untrustworthy in the long term, forcing Ukraine to, rapidly look for alternatives.
Okay, so let's dig into that. The core issue of strategic reliability versus, let's call it, political optics. Starting with the Greenland crisis, you argue the U.S. threats against Denmark fundamentally breach trust. We know that Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, she stated plainly that a forcible U.S. takeover would mean the end of NATO as we know it. So from Kyiv's perspective, how can they possibly trust an Article 5 guarantee when one of its primary guarantors is threatening to tear up the UN Charter against another member?
That is exactly the dangerous paradox. The U.S. administration, by pursuing territory outside of existing treaties, is modeling the exact same behavior, annexation, territorial acquisition, that Russia used to justify the war in Ukraine. This unilateral might-is-right approach, which Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth seemed to endorse by, refusing to rule out military force. That's what experts fear. The Donroe Doctrine, as it's been interpreted, it's based on this transactional view of alliances and an assertive global resource grab. They're targeting the Panama Canal, parts of Canada, and most aggressively, Greenland. So when the U.S. starts acting like a great power interested only in redrawing maps for its own benefit, what confidence can Ukraine have that its own territorial integrity will be upheld once it becomes politically inconvenient for Washington?
Okay, I agree the rhetoric and the policy around Greenland are damaging to alliance cohesion. I absolutely do. But we have to frame this in the cold light of great power strategy. I would argue this is a ruthless pursuit of critical strategic assets. Assets necessary for U.S. long-term competition, especially with China and Russia. Greenland holds vast, untapped reserves of rare earth minerals, indispensable for modern weaponry. And crucially, control of the island is vital for controlling the GIUK gap, that key maritime choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. Control of that is essential for bottling up the Russian Northern Fleet.
So you're arguing that sacrificing NATO solidarity in violating international law is justified because Washington needs rare earth minerals and military control of the Arctic?
I'm arguing that the administration views U.S. control as strategically necessary to prevent Russia and China from gaining a decisive foothold in the Arctic. The action is undeniably crude, yes, but its focus is strategic. It's about maintaining supremacy over Moscow and maintaining that pressure, diverting Russian resources to the Arctic that ultimately benefits Kyiv by keeping the main adversary contained. And anyway, the European response, while critical, was political. The U.S. military footprint in the GIUK gap remains the backbone of the region's defense. This is about cold calculation for global dominance.
That's a compelling argument for the U.S. strategic interest, I'll give you that. But it entirely sidesteps the question of reliability. That same cold calculation turns coercive very quickly when you apply it directly to Kyiv, and that is where the trust truly breaks down. So let's talk about the transactional nature of U.S. aid, which I think reveals the administration's real priorities. In March 2025, the administration paused $1 billion in military aid and intelligence sharing. This wasn't an accident. It was specifically designed to pressure Kyiv into immediate peace negotiations. That isn't a partnership. It's coercion.
While the U.S. has a legitimate strategic interest in pushing for a negotiated end to this war, especially given the sheer scale of the investment, leverage was necessary to bring both sides to the table. The peace plan, presented by officials like Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleets, was very explicit. They threatened to stop weapons if Ukraine refused talks, but they also threatened to increase sanctions on Russia if Moscow refused. It was a dual-track strategy. Plus, sanctions against major Russian energy firms, Rosneft, Lukoil, were extended in February and October 2025. That shows severe leverage was consistently applied to Moscow, too. The strategic need to keep Russia contained, it just outweighs these temporary high-pressure negotiating tactics.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the leverage was evenly applied. And let me tell you why. Look at the specific demands placed on Ukraine during that aid suspension. It was widely reported that the administration asked for outright ownership of half of Ukraine's mineral and oil resources as payment for support it had already received, a demand President Zelenskyy reportedly rejected, calling it an attempt to sell Ukraine away.
I acknowledge the demand was heavy-handed.
Heavy-handed is an understatement. Analysts across Europe compared that demand to the reparations imposed on Germany at the Treaty of Versailles, a move that fundamentally undermined Germany's sovereignty and created instability for decades. This is fundamentally punitive. You couple that with the relentless public attacks from within the administration. You had officials blaming Ukraine for starting the war, calling Zelenskyy a dictator without elections. It signals profound disrespect and a desire to force an unfavorable ceasefire on the current front lines.
Okay, the rhetoric was unacceptable and the mineral demand was, yes, a grotesque negotiating ploy. But equating it to Versailles ignores a crucial fact. Ukraine rejected the demand, and the strategic interest in arming them persisted. The aid suspension was lifted, and it all culminated in a crucial, multi-year $90 billion arms agreement announced in September 2025. That deal wasn't a punishment. It was the largest commitment since the war began. It proves that beneath the coercive surface, the underlying strategic imperative to keep Ukraine fighting and thereby weakening Russia is still Washington's default setting.
But the coercion fundamentally shifts the goalposts. Defense Secretary Hegseth openly supported this when he called regaining pre-2014 borders an unrealistic objective. This transactional bullying serves Moscow's long-term interests. It forces a pause. It potentially locks in Russia's gains, like some analysts warned about the infrastructure truce. It forces Ukraine to negotiate from a position of weakness. So the fact that aid continues doesn't mean it's reliable. It means aid is only guaranteed if Ukraine continually bows to US&D policy demands, whether it's negotiating on bad terms or surrendering its own resources.
But that calculation is precisely why the partnership, however flawed, remains essential. Ukraine's ability to repel Russia depends on a scale of commitment that, right now, only the US industrial base can sustain. While Ukraine is pushing self-sufficiency, and that's great, that $90 billion arms deal is proof that Washington understands the global stakes.
And that is where we see the most profound shift. It goes right back to the instability caused by the Greenland threats. U.S. unpredictability is forcing Europe and Ukraine to secure their own futures through self-reliance. And that in itself mitigates American leverage. The European response was unified political pushback on Greenland, and now that's translating into substantive coordinated defense policy.
Could you elaborate on that? How is that political unity translating into hard defense capacity?
Absolutely. We're seeing a direct effort to mitigate the risk of slow or paused U.S. supplies. Look at the European Defense Industry Program. It specifically earmarks 300 million euros to integrate Ukraine's defense industrial base into Europe's own. That is a concrete step toward eliminating dependency on unpredictable aid. And Ukraine itself is prioritizing self-sufficiency. The Army of Drones project, domestic weapons production, the nomination of Mykolaiv Fedorov, an architect of that drone initiative, as the new defense minister. It signals Kyiv is correctly prioritizing long-term independent capability over reliance on a volatile partner.
I recognize the necessity of that move toward European integration and self-sufficiency. It's a strategically sound response to Washington's volatility. However, the scale of this conflict demands a superpower commitment that Europe simply cannot meet yet. Europe's current deployable forces, their stockpiles, they're historically low. The proposed multinational force from the Paris Declaration is a significant political step, sure, but it can't replace the U.S. military footprint or industrial capacity in the immediate future.
But the political independence is growing. The European leaders showed a remarkably unified front against the Greenland threat, something we've rarely seen in recent decades. This is precisely the kind of independent, assertive coalition that Ukraine needs to counter Russian aggression, one that isn't contingent on the unpredictable whims of an America First administration.
And yet, Europe still relies heavily on the U.S. for maintaining massive economic pressure on Moscow. U.S. sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, they continue to squeeze Moscow's revenue stream in a way Europe can't realistically execute alone, without immediate economic self-harm. At the end of the day, the U.S. commitment to strategic stability with Russia, as defined in their national security strategy, is the geopolitical anchor that Europe and Ukraine still rely on.
I agree that U.S. actions remain consequential, especially sanctions. But the Danish intelligence service itself said that America's unpredictable approach, shown perfectly by Greenland, pushes countries towards seeking stability elsewhere. It even makes Beijing seem like a more stable partner in some sectors. Ukraine cannot build its survival strategy on a volatile superpower's momentary alignment of interests. The Greenland controversy is the clearest warning possible that reliance on Washington subjects Kyiv to unpredictable geopolitical pressure that undermines its very sovereignty.
So we've established that U.S. foreign policy under this administration is transactional, disruptive, and demonstrably willing to coerce its allies. Yet Ukraine's strategic importance in the broader great power competition, exemplified by the Arctic, by the need to counter Russia, means the U.S. is fundamentally unable to fully turn its back on Kyiv. The partnership it's deeply flawed. It's marred by unacceptable rhetoric and heavy-handed pressure. But tragically, it remains strategically essential for Ukraine's ability to scale its defense. That $90 billion deal, despite the political cost, proves the strategic lifeline is still intact.
And my core concern remains the irreversible erosion of the collective security framework Ukraine needs. The pattern of threats against Denmark's sovereignty, against the integrity of the Panama Canal, and the shocking demands for Ukraine's mineral wealth, it all signals a definitive shift from a rules-based order to one where might is right politics dominates. So Kiev must be highly skeptical, and wisely it is prioritizing European integration and self-reliance. American reliability is now subject to the unpredictable, imperial impulses we saw over Greenland,
which makes hedging against Washington's volatility a core part of Ukraine's national defense strategy.
You've been listening to Defense Report by Alex and Arya, where we analyze the latest in military strategy, global defense, and advanced weaponry.
Subscribe to Defense Reports, your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports. We'll catch you next time.